Hi, in this video we're going to be talking about the federal fair housing laws. And under federal law there are 7 protected classes, and they are race, color, religion or creed, national origin, sex or gender, handicapped status, also called disability, and familial status. So let's take each one of these separately. And the way you can remember these, by the way, is an acronym. Realtors can really sell houses fast now. Realtors for race, R for race, C for color, R for religion or creed, S for sex, H for handicap status, F for familial status, and N for national origin. So they're in a little different order than I mentioned them on the previous slide, but this may help you remember. It's called Realtors Can Really Sell Houses Fast Now. So there are actually 2 sets of fair housing laws. One way back when, after the Civil War, the 1866 Civil Rights Act, which prohibits discrimination based on race or color for any reason, not just housing, but for any reason. But at that time, these laws were really not enforced very much. But today, we actually do see them being enforced. It wasn't until 1968 that the Fair Housing Act, as we presently know it, was passed in Congress. And then in 1988, the law was actually amended to add the handicap status and the familial status. So originally, it was race, color, religion, sex, and national origin, and then in 1988, handicap status and familial status. So both the 1968 and the 1988 Acts prohibit discrimination in housing against those 7 protected classes that we've already mentioned. And discrimination includes a number of things. The first one would be refusing to sell, to rent, or to negotiate with someone based on their race, color, creed, etc. To quote different terms to people because of their race, color, religion, national origin, and so on. To actually place ads which are discriminatory. For example, you can't say that we will only want people of this religion or only people of this color can live here. Fourth, it prevents what's known as steering. Now, steering is the process of directing people to or away from certain neighborhoods because of their race, color, creed, etc. In other words, you might perceive that a Hispanic couple might want to live in a Hispanic, whatever that means, neighborhood. So you direct them away from areas where there are not an abundance of Hispanic people. That would be considered to be steering. So here we have a map of Philadelphia back in the 1920s or 30s, J.M. Brewer's map of Philadelphia. And in this particular map, they've indicated certain areas of the city where people are Italian or Jewish, or they're using the word colored here. This was quite common back prior to the 1968 fair housing laws. Clearly illegal today, but when looking at these maps, you can see how the pattern of discrimination is really ingrained. It was ingrained in us back in those days. The next thing on our list here of things which are discriminatory is called blockbusting. Blockbusting is also called panic peddling or blockbusting. And in blockbusting, what would happen is a speculator would come into a neighborhood which was changing, typically a city neighborhood which was predominantly white and changing into an African American neighborhood. And if you're familiar with the show All in the Family, there are some episodes on All in the Family that actually go to this whole situation of blockbusting. So what would happen is a speculator would come in and they might say to a white family, well, you better sell now and save equity because guess who's moving into the neighborhood? Trying to buy that property at a low price and then turn around and sell it at a much higher price. That's blockbusting, and that's illegal. Also, discrimination includes what's called redlining. Now, redlining is a practice that lenders had and also insurance companies had where they actually drew lines around neighborhoods and said, okay, these areas are somewhat suspect. And basically, they were discriminating against people of certain colors or certain creeds or races. All right, and here's some other maps from the Homeowners Loan Corporation maps of Philadelphia back in the 1930s. And you can see some of those areas there that are marked in red. Those red areas, and that's where the term redlining comes from, those red areas where lenders were very wary about making loans, not because of the person's financial ability, but because of their race, color, religion, etc. So another form of discrimination would include denying membership in a multiple listing service or a realtor or other real estate association. You know, whenever a law is passed, there are always some people that feel they should be exempt. So in 1968, when this law was passed, there were 4 exemptions that were built into the law. The first one is a for sale by owner. For sale by owner who owns 3 or fewer properties, does not use a broker, and does not advertise in any discriminatory fashion. In theory, they are exempt from the fair housing laws of 1968. Now, as we'll see in a minute, you have to be careful there because the 1866 Act has no exemptions. So also, 1 to 4 family owner-occupied rentals are exempt. The idea behind this is the idea of a little old lady in her boarding house and she wants to rent out rooms to people that she feels comfortable with. All right. Well, this got kind of extended. So 1 to 4 family units, so a single family, duplex, triplex, or fourplex, in which one of the units is owner-occupied, that owner is exempt from the 1968 Fair Housing Act. Religious organizations are also exempt if they rent housing to people only of their faith. So, for example, if the Catholic Church owned some apartment buildings and they wanted to rent them out only to Catholics, they would be able to do that. The caveat here is the religion cannot discriminate on any other basis other than the religion. So if they wanted to eliminate Protestants who were Hispanic, they would not be able to take advantage of that exemption in the law. And the fourth one is private clubs or private organizations who might own residential properties so long as they do not rent them out commercially. So, for example, let's say the Aryan Brotherhood owned some residential rentals up in the White Mountains. Now, where else would they own property? All right, so but they only go up there and meet and rent these out during the wintertime. So during the summertime, they decide to rent them out commercially to anybody and everybody that might be interested. They would not be able to be exempt from the 1968 Act because of the fact they're renting them out commercially and not just using them for their members. So there are 4 exemptions to this 1968 Act. But you have to realize, again, there are no exemptions in the 1866 Civil Rights Act. So the 1866 law, what did it say? No discrimination based on race or color. So if someone tried to discriminate against someone in any of these areas based on their race or color, they would potentially be liable under the 1866 Civil Rights Act. Now in 1988, there were 2 additions to the Fair Housing Act from 1968. As I've already mentioned, they are handicap status and also familial status. And handicap status, more commonly known as disability, has a number of different examples. In fact, in your course material, you see that handicap is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits an individual's activities. Some examples would include a visual problem, hearing or speech impairment, heart disease, cancer, mental illness, HIV or AIDS. So they're basically anything that affects someone's activities could render them to be considered to be handicapped under the fair housing laws. And a handicapped person is not someone who abuses illegal drugs and is not someone who might be a threat to others. So for example, in your material, a handicapped person is not someone who abuses controlled illegal substances or is a threat to the health, safety, or property of others. For example, an alcoholic would fall into the handicap definition, but behavioral manifestations can be taken into consideration and could allow a landlord to refuse renting to that person. So other areas of discrimination would be refusing to make reasonable accommodations for a handicapped person. And there are some examples here in your course material. Refusing to permit a tenant who's handicapped to modify the interior of the unit so he or she can enjoy it. The renter must modify the unit at their own expense and has to agree to restore the unit to its pre-modification condition after the tenant moves out. So if you're a landlord, or if you're dealing with somebody who is a landlord, you should be familiar with, if you're in property management, you really need to be familiar with these examples and the accommodations that have to be made. Requiring a larger security deposit than might be customary is prohibited. However, if modifications are extensive and the tenant has a poor credit history, the landlord can require the tenant to pay a reasonable sum into an interest-bearing escrow account. Also, it would be discriminatory to refuse to make reasonable accommodations in the rules or policies so a handicapped tenant can enjoy the unit. For example, let's say a new tenant is handicapped and there are no other handicap spaces close to the entrance. As the landlord, you should be willing to create another handicap space and ask one of the other tenants to have their parking space reassigned to a different spot. So now let's talk about the familial status exemption. Familial status basically means you cannot discriminate against families with children under the age of 18. This also, by the way, includes families that are expecting a child or families who are in the process of adopting a child. Both of those would be considered to fall under the term familial status. So as an example, if a family with children wanted to rent one of your units, you would not be able to say, I'm sorry, we don't allow children. And in fact, there was a situation here in southern Arizona some years ago where an owner of an apartment complex, he had 3 or 4 buildings in this complex, had one building which was set aside for families with children, but families with children could not live in the other buildings. Complaints were made about this, and this person was fined substantially, because you can't just say all families, you live in this building and these other buildings are reserved for families without children. Now, there are some exemptions in the fair housing laws for older persons, and there are 2 that you need to be aware of. The first is if all of the occupants in the property or in the subdivision or in the apartment building are 62 or older, then they can say no families with children. Also, if at least 80% of the households are occupied by one person 55 or older, then again, they can say, I'm sorry, we don't allow families with children. And there are subdivisions in a lot of retirement communities that are designed for adults, adult living, and they must maintain this particular arrangement, 80% of households, at least 80% occupied by one person 55 or older, to be able to rely on that exemption. Now, as a real estate company selling residential real estate, you should always have or use the fair housing logo in all of your advertising. And the fair housing poster is something that you should always display in your office. They're available in English, also in Spanish, and I'm sure in communities where there are other languages that are spoken, you can find these fair housing posters in those languages. Now, your advertising cannot be discriminatory. So no discriminatory wording. For example, saying in your ad, no wheelchairs allowed, that's considered to be discriminatory. Or using the term able-bodied only, that would be discriminatory. So there are a number of publications out there that you can access which indicate which words might not be acceptable, which terms might not be acceptable, and so on. Check with your broker when it comes down to what wording might be appropriate or might not be appropriate. In your advertising, if you're using photos, make sure your photos are representative of the community. So don't just use Caucasians in your ad, but use African Americans and Hispanics and Asians. Make sure your advertising is broad-based. So how are the fair housing laws enforced? Well, someone who has a complaint has 1 year to file that complaint with HUD, who will follow up on that complaint. Or they have 2 years to sue in federal court. The penalties are pretty strict. First-time violation, $50,000. Subsequent violations, $100,000 are potential. Now, if you have a complaint based on the 1866 law, those complaints can't go to HUD. They have to go to federal court. So that's our video on the federal fair housing laws.